Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys. I'm sort of really into these Europe cartoon maps right now, and that's what I'm putting there. Alright, I think Melkor recommended this over on Discord. If you're new to the channel, hello, my name is Connor. I like to learn about history through YouTube recommendations. The original link to the video is at the top of the description below. Right below that is the link to the Discord. Just click on that, it'll send you right over there. Love for you to join. Makes it easier for me to interact with you guys and create that sort of atmosphere that I want to create over here on YouTube and Discord. Okay, let's do it. New video out like a week. What days? 10 days ago. Alternate History Hub, great channel. All right. If you're not ready to learn, get out. I guess this isn't really learning. It's more like hypothetical. All right, just get ready to listen. Let's go. Everything good? Okay. Hope you're all doing well, by the way. If you are, that's great. If not, that sucks. But you'll be good soon. Let's go.
After 2 world wars, everyone was done with Germany. And even as World War II was ongoing, there were plans of what to do with Germany once the fighting had ended. Now, as we know, Germany was divided between the 4 victors, and the tensions of the Cold War eventually split it into 2 states. It makes sense why Germany was split in the way that it was, considering the Soviets held that territory. And so we never really think of it going different. How else could anyone have imagined it being divided? Turns out a few had their own ideas on how to split the Germans.
So they just sort of created the... Sorry. I'm not sorry. I gotta get better at standing up for myself. So the borders were just kind of set the way they were because that's where the troops of the respective, you know, the French, American, English side, and then the Russian east side. Is that just like where it fell, like where they met up?
So we never really think of it going different. How else could anyone have imagined it being divided? Turns out a few had their own ideas on how to split the Germans, each making their own lines on a map about what a post-war Germany should look like. There were multiple plans, so I and another alternate history channel, What If Alt Hist, decided to pick a different plan. Each of us would pick one plan and then theorize how that specific map would turn out in history. FDR had a plan to just entirely dissolve Germany, reorganizing it into smaller states. Not quite as small as in the Holy Roman Empire, but small enough. What If Alt Hist theorizes about how such a plan might pan out in his own video, so go check that out. There was also a plan by good old Churchill to split Germany north to south, with the south being a horrific abomination. Oh god. Guess Churchill drank a bit too much and felt sentimental about the days gone by, you know, when Austria-Hungary still existed. Yet there was one plan that, even though it hadn't been implemented, it did have real-world consequences, and it was considered a plan from the US Secretary of the Treasury, of all people, Henry Morgenthau. Morgenthau wanted to divide Germany alongside the North and South lines as well, but with one major difference. The industrial heartland of Germany in the West, the source of its economic and militaristic strength, would be entirely removed from its borders. A deliberate plan to fundamentally alter German society, not only in denazification, but to remove its capability to ever be—
I just want to say, it really is crazy as I'm starting to put myself in the shoes of being on the victor side of World War II. Not even just a leader, just like anyone, just like, all right, we let that happen twice. The first one might not have been Germany's fault. Maybe that's a topic for another day. But the second one is like, all right, we can't let this happen again. It's just, it's easy to not be able to think like they would have been forced to think like.
Be a modern nation again, but to remove its capability to ever be a modern nation again. What if in an alternate timeline, somehow, This plan was agreed upon, the Morgenthau Plan. It's an alternate 1945. The war is over. Yippee. I would imagine that in this timeline, the plan for what would happen to Germany is entirely unknown to the public. The Morgenthau Plan is not leaked to the press, mostly because, if it still is, it faced the same scrutiny that it did in our timeline. This is a scenario where the Western powers are much harsher to Germany and fully commit to absolute revenge. It was hard to simply let many aspects of German society continue on after so much destruction had occurred. There was no real urge to follow through with the Morgenthau Plan, for reasons I'm going to get into. And this was stemmed from fears of the plan failing so badly that it would only backfire in the face of the West, undoing all of the gains that they made during the war. Not only out of a worry that Nazism would resurface, but also that the German public would turn to the Soviets and communism in response. In such a timeline, let's imagine these considerations are just not thought about. Over the course of the next few years, the Americans, British, and French would begin the deconstruction and demolition of any factory or manufacturing plant in the region. A region that Germany relied on for not simply wartime production, but production of everyday basic goods. You know, the factories that we need for a modern society. The people who relied on these factories for jobs or production would protest these actions, of course, perhaps leading to riots and open rebellion, only to be brutally taken down by occupation forces. The Allied forces would then proceed to tell people living in this international zone, and this was the plan, by the way, I'm not making this up, that the German people would never again be allowed to have manufacturing or industry at all. Those that relied on the factories for jobs should move elsewhere instead.
Oh, they're pretty darn good at that today still.
At all. Those that relied on the factories for jobs should move elsewhere instead. In effect, this plan was to remove the capability for millions of working men to provide for their families. No factories of any kind would be allowed to exist in what was once the industrial heartland of Germany. And the thing was, this was an action that Morgenthau fully anticipated, as what he essentially planned was bringing an industrial state back into an agricultural society. As for the rest of Germany, it would be split between North and South. The idea was to differentiate between the heavily Catholic South and the Prussian Protestant North. Somehow Prussia still exists in this timeline, so you take some and you leave some. I would imagine this North German state would be smaller than originally planned, just by how much advancement the Soviet troops made. And it's likely it may have been split into even 3 states, and such a confusing mess between the 3 wouldn't really be a concern, as Germany being a functioning state isn't in the question. Germany is no longer meant to be a state.
What about, you gotta give Poland some, if the USSR would let them.
This perpetual occupation was what turned many off of the idea of the Morgenthau Plan in the first place.
Did I miss something?
Isn't in the question. Germany is no longer meant to be a state. This perpetual occupation was what turned many off of the idea of the Morgenthau Plan in the first place, and Churchill even commented that he didn't want the British tied to what was essentially a dead corpse. As what happens when you remove the industry from a society? You remove the ability for anybody to feed themselves or make a living, and you essentially created a humanitarian crisis.
That's the thing, it's like, you're so angry justifiably at this guy at Hitler and people major up in like the the death squads, SS, like the people who had who were in charge of the Holocaust, Himmler, I think. But it's like, after all this time, and you're so pissed and you're so angry, and like, the people who you should take the anger out on are dead, and there's all that left over. It can be so tempting to just take that out, I guess, on the normal citizens, because you justify they were helping the effort that killed people in your, and it's just, it's got to be horrifying. Being the occupied country so many times in history after you lost a big war, especially a nasty one with a lot of built-up tension that is going to be released on the citizens. it's like I always say, I would hate, I want to just, all right, let's go.
Yet sticking with the
I hope that made sense a little.
Morgenthau plan, there is no room for foreign aid to the Germans. The people were now a part of an agrarian state and should use that to their advantage. However, there's an issue. Poor harvests and the lack of production of fertilizer in the post-war years resulted in food frankly not being existent. Germany, even in our own timeline, didn't have the capability to feed its own people. Yet there was no American aid in this alternate world. Instead, the plan continues on. So here's the thing. It has been estimated that if the Morgenthau plan continued on as it was planned, an estimated 25 men
Jesus Christ. What's that little dark green spot? Did he mention that already?
continued on as it was planned, an estimated 25 million people would have starved to death. 5 times as many Germans would die in the Allied occupation than in the war itself. So at this point, it's pretty clear that had the actual Morgenthau plan gone through, and it was apparent that so many people were going to starve to death, the Allies would have backed off such a harsh plan. They weren't going to just let millions starve to death in the middle of Europe. But let's say that they did anyway. It's not like the Germans could, fight back. First off, imagine how exactly it would appear following the war, when the victorious Allied powers, in this case the Western powers, occupy Germany and simply stand by and watch as millions die under their control.
I wonder, honestly, if there would be a lot of outrage. Probably eventually, but I mean, I feel like a lot of people would not be very sympathetic. Maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, I don't really know who, after the war and pretty much all that's left, China's rebuilding. I mean, China's destroyed by Japan and everything. So all that's left is the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, the U.S. I mean, so if the U.S., France, and Great Britain do this plan, and the Soviets do not like the Germans, they probably dislike them more than anyone. I mean, who exactly on the national stage are you going to show a bad image to? That would have consequences.
Would be an atrocity even greater than the Holodomor, actually, by many, many more millions. In fact, it'd mean that the Western powers would have killed just as many innocents as the Nazis in Russia or the Japanese in China. So by doing this, by committing to this, the Western powers in many ways immediately lose their validity after the war. To the German people, they were brainwashed by the Nazi regime and told that if the war was lost, German society would die, along with everyone they knew and loved. Yet, post-war, the German people instead saw the American occupation with planes flying in food when they were hungry, a plan to rebuild their society, and a removal of an ideology that only brought them pain. Now instead, in this alternate timeline, the Americans tear down the factories, internationalize a large chunk of their country, split Germany in two, and then their troops openly parade in the streets and sit by while a quarter of the population openly and slowly starves to death. So, had this plan actually continued, the victorious Allies would have committed equal atrocities to the Nazis, or at least enough atrocities to muddle the waters in the most black and white good versus evil war ever. The end of World War II would not be the end of Nazism or fascism within Germany. In fact, it would only openly solidify Nazi propaganda against the Americans. For the Germans, the war would have been seen as one of self-defense against a ruthless cabal that the Nazis were talking about. And now, the Americans were going to kill everyone. God, this video is going to get demonetized so bad. And in fact, the ending of World War II for Germany would very much be like the end of World War I. A nation once again defeated, but the ideology continues on. There is no scenario where it's split in two and then reunited and becomes the undisputed leader of Europe. There is no EU. Any chance that it may in a way be integrated into the West, snuffed out after such a failed occupation. And so this is a part of a lesson. The peace after a war is often more important than any battle or conflict, especially in a war of ideologies. To win a conflict, you can't.
This is so, it's very cool. And it should be obvious, but it's caused me to think more about it. So, even if you destroy someone, an army as big as Germany's, or in a war as big as World War II, smaller conflicts too, when you annihilate the opposition, your immediate thoughts might be, well, retribution, they get what they deserve. But I just wonder how many centuries and centuries of history of warfare and the aftermaths, how many of that had to happen in order for people to be like, okay, all right, we won, but so many times this backfired, and we demoralized and destroyed our opponents, and then 60 years later or earlier, another one rises up and more people die. And it really is an important point about how the peace process is. I think Treaty of Versailles is a good example.
Simply outproduce your enemy or beat them on the battlefield. And not only did fascism need to collapse under its own weight and for its former supporters to see it for the sham that it was, there also needed to be a replacement ideology to step in and fundamentally better the society afterwards. This was in many ways why the West went with the Marshall Plan instead. By rebuilding Germany and showing them how the Americans and British were not the corrupt monsters Hitler had portrayed them to be, it allowed for the transition into a democratic state to be easier, more homegrown, and
this is important. It's something that doesn't sit very right with me. And, overall, given the circumstances and everything that happened, there wasn't much of a choice. But I think that a lot of countries like Japan, and maybe you could say this about any country, but I feel like a lot of the modern, past since World War II, ways of governing and everything is just the way that Great Britain and the United States thinks a society should go. And so if I was from any of these other countries, I'd be like, well, so we can't have like an identity, no? Like if you're German or you're Japanese today, I just wonder how you see history, I guess, and do you look around and think like this is all just, it's obviously still Germany or still Japan, but it's in a template that was forced on the victors of World War II. Again, I don't know if I explained that great, but I had to get that thought out.
One example to show the benefits of democracy was by bringing in truckloads of food to a starving population. Yes, you can argue this was to prevent the Germans from turning to the Soviets, but it was also to delegitimize the fear-mongering the fascists had brainwashed the population with for years. This was a crucial junction point for Germany, and if the worst case scenario of World War II was the Nazis winning, the second worst case scenario would be if people thought the Nazis, by accident, were proven correct. And to a terrifying degree, many would begin to think Germany was better off under the Nazis because at least they had food. The democratic institutions put in place are not really supported by the people, and if they are, they're only increasingly right-wing or left. No hearts and minds are one. The German republics are seen simply as puppets. And as what happens with any puppet, once the hand is taken out, it goes limp. While this video is about World War II, this more importantly is a video about institutions and ideologies. Institutions only have credibility if people have faith in them. If the Morgenthau Plan had gone through, it would have given the Germans their first view of democracy, one as a punishment, a distinct negative in their lives. And this would cause a hatred that only undermines the very governments set up as replacement.
Honestly, look what's going on with Afghanistan right now. You went in 20 years and telling the people there that, you're going to be safe with us and everything like that. And then they pull out, and then people are going to get slaughtered. And then you're just shown as like, okay, if anytime someone's having this conflict, they're going to think twice about letting America in, even more than Vietnam and what now, because it looks like you're just going to abandon at any moment, and then even worse, just let you be slaughtered by the people that you're pledging allegiance to you defeat, you know, and
For the Nazis.
Oh,
If a government
Afghanistan.
is only held up by foreign force, then it's simply a puppet, and it will collapse easily once the occupational force leaves. Every single time. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
awesome video. Melkor, it was Melkor, right? Yep. Thanks for the recommendation. I'm going to get to the 30 Years War episode soon. And today, maybe today. If not, then tomorrow. See you guys.